Start the recording.
Hi there, this is Philip Merlo. I think I'm the first speaker. Is there a way for me to share my screen eventually?
There will be. Yeah. So Philip, once we get going, we're going to do just some really brief welcome and introductions.
Awesome.
And then we're going to pass to you. So Philip, there should be a way for you to indicate share my screen in your control panel. Do you see the black rectangular box with the
Yes.
little
Okay, I see it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So you're just going to, it's totally open. You're just going to take control. And for the 30 minutes that you and Dylan are going to present, you have control. And then after you, we are going to pass it. Well, we'll do some, I'll get it back because then we're going to do some breakout rooms. And then we'll pass it to Heather from OEHA, and then she'll have control for a bit. So it'll be a very participatory, mostable, managed meeting tonight. Great.
Cool.
Okay, we are at 5:30. In the interest of time, because I know we have a full agenda tonight and we already have 61 participants, I'm going to say thank you for being here and welcome to the Stockton Community Steering Committee meeting number 3. Just a few etiquette rules while we're getting started. If you haven't already changed your name, please do so by your picture so we know who's talking, first and last name and affiliation if necessary, please. That laughter makes me remind, please stay on mute unless you are talking. I know we're all sheltering in place at home, or many of us are at least, and we have potentially roommates or children or dogs and whatnot. So totally understandable, but if we could all just stay on mute unless we know we're talking, that would be really great because there's a lot of folks on this line. As we go through these presentations and this dialogue, we're going to use the little blue raise your hand feature to indicate that in a nonverbal way that you have a question for the presenter. The way the presentations are going to run tonight, we're going to ask that the presenters present their material, and then there's time for question and discussion afterwards. So please hold your questions till after they present, but we'll be checking in after each of the presentations, and just keep your little blue hand up, and that will indicate. And then Hannah and I, my colleague Hannah, will be helping to manage that queue of hands raised. Hannah, do you want to explain for a sec where they can find the little blue hand?
Yes, to find your little blue hand, you're gonna click on Manage Participants on the bottom of your screen. You click on you have participants, just participants, no manage, I have manage. Click on participants and little side pane is gonna pop up on your right hand of your screen probably. And that's where you will see the raise your hand.
Awesome. If at any point you're experiencing any technical difficulties or you can't find something, please send Hannah, the woman who was just speaking, a chat, Hannah Samakovich at the Institute for Local Government, a chat, and she will be able to help you out during the duration of the meeting. And again, the chat box we're going to use for other comments or questions or ways for you to communicate to each other. Just as a reminder, we are obviously following the state and local COVID-19 guidelines, and we really appreciate everyone's patience. This is the first full official Stockton 617 meeting we're doing virtually. So we really are just so grateful that everybody still wants to participate and is happy to engage. And we're just gonna ask for everyone's patience and understanding. This is a new platform for a lot of us, and it's just a learning situation for everyone. So thank you in advance for that. I am now going to switch to the roster, and we are going to see who's all on the call. Okay, so we're going to go, everybody, you could be unmuted at this point. We're just going to go down the list of roster. And if you are here, and I'm going to butcher some of your names, I'm so sorry in advance, I'm terrible with names. Just say here, if you're here, as we go down. So starting at the top, Jasari, Gloria E.
Here.
Awesome. Nayeli, Cruz Gomez. Donald Donier.
Here.
Here.
Nice, Donald. Awesome. Mary Elizabeth.
Here.
Jennifer Flores. Oh, does everyone not see my roster?
No, no.
We don't see the roster.
You have to stop sharing and share again.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay. Now can everyone see the roster? Okay.
Yes.
I think we were on Jennifer Flores. Eugene Fuss. There's a bit of an echo, so let's try this again. Let's say mute yourself unless you see that you're coming up, and then unmute yourself in order to say here. Let's try that. So Regina Griffin. Alfred Gross.
I am here, yes, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, Regina. Alfred Gross. Nicholas Hatton. Ned. I think I saw Ned. Anthony Marcus.
Macias, here.
Yes, sorry. See, I'm going to mess up names. Missy Ray. Willie Marquez.
Hi.
Thanks. Bianca Mendoza. Here. Hi, Bianca. Vanessa.
Here.
Palomares. Hi, Vanessa. Stacy.
Here.
Hi.
Hi.
Fantastic. Margot Proust.
Here.
Debbie Provost. Or DB. Okay. Florence Polonakov.
Here.
Sorry about your name. Okay. I think Jalen's not coming. Leonard Seward. Glenabelle Torino.
Here.
Leonard Seawood is here.
Thanks, Leonard. Douglas Vigil.
Here.
All right. This is not here. Kevin Amon.
Here.
Jordan.
Here.
Irene. Sylvia.
Here.
Can't.
Here.
Sylvia. Dylan.
Here.
And is Elaine here as well?
Here.
Hi, guys. Diamond Dixon. Naomi Garcia Ugari.
Here.
Hi, Naomi. Catherine.
Here.
And is Cynthia here as well, your alternate?
Yeah, I'm here as well. Hello, everybody.
Awesome. Hello. Tina Lau.
Here.
Mariah Looney.
Here.
Hi, Mariah. How about Barbara? Your alternate. Is she here?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry.
Awesome. Hi, Barbara. Ellen Powell.
I'm here.
Hi, Ellen. Jonathan Pruitt.
I'm here.
Jonathan, you're here. What about Veronica? Your alternate.
Here.
Is she coming? Hi. Awesome.
Hi, everyone.
Kendra Templeton.
Here.
Hi, Kendra. Esperanza.
Here.
Awesome. And then thought we saw Cynthia already. Did we not see Cynthia already?
I'm here.
Awesome. Edward.
Here.
Hi, Ed. Robin de Guzman.
Here.
Hi, Robin. Maria Mendez. Okay, what about Albert Rivas? Or Anne Rogan?
Here.
Hi, Anne. And last but not least, Jeff Wingfield.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Jeff. Is there anyone in the steering committee that I didn't mention, that didn't get a chance to introduce themselves?
Yes, Nicholas Hatton just joined.
Welcome. Thanks, Nicholas. Okay, I'm going to go over to the Air District staff. You guys want to quickly introduce yourselves?
Jamie Holt. Jessica Olson.
Thanks, Jamie.
Ryan Hayashi.
I'm Heather Hanks.
John Klassen.
And Zong, are you back? Zong and Anthony?
Anthony Presto.
Ariana Hooks.
Okay, that's all the Air District staff. Let's go to CARB staff. Who do we got tonight?
Hi, good evening. It's Scott Wall.
Alejandro Cervantes.
Dave Salardino.
Kara Buckley.
Veronica Edie.
Karina Aguilera.
Trish Johnson.
Hello.
Joe Guerrero.
And Natalie Spiegel.
Eric Bissinger.
Okay. Okay. Are there any members of the public or anyone else that I haven't asked to introduce themselves?
This is Peter Zemek with Montrose Environmental Group.
I'm Jan Moore with Innovative Climate.
Jan Moore. Welcome, Jan.
Bob Brown with WISPA.
Hello, Paul.
Joe Hickey with Acclima.
Joey.
Ariana Ortega with Grid Alternatives.
Hi, Ariana. Thanks for coming.
Crystal Upperman with Acclima.
Hello, Crystal.
And Nick Pierce from the Air District as well. I'm sorry, I was muted earlier.
No problem. Thanks for coming, Nick. Okay, as you can see, there are 82 participants on this Zoom call. So that's quite a lot. So we're going to ask everyone to now mute themselves. And again, going back to, if you have a question for the presenter, you're going to raise your blue hand. Other ways to communicate will be via the chat box. And I'm going to pass it over to Ryan, who's going to do the welcome from the Air District.
Thank you very much, Crystal, and welcome everybody. This is so exciting. Like Crystal said, 82 participants. I'd like to say I'm surprised, but I'm really not. Based on just our first few meetings that we had up there, we knew we were going to have fantastic participation from this committee. I know you're going to bring a lot of insight and suggestions to make probably the best SERP of any SERP that we've done. Obviously, we want to help in that. Really want to thank Dylan for taking the time, Dylan Delbo, for taking the time to work with us on a really, what looks to be a very packed agenda, but I think it does allow for a lot of time for discussion and other opportunities to get the community involvement that we're all looking for. And so great start to what we hope will be a very productive process. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, I neglected, I think there's one person who's on the Zoom call just on their phone. The person whose phone number ends with 1976. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Maria Mendez, I'm here.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, thank you.
Of course. And so, Maria, just as a reminder, so if you want to raise your hand, you're going to push *9, and that will raise your hand in our system. So we'll know that you want to ask a question as well. Okay.
Perfect, thank
And
you.
then I also, great. I see Jacob Klein from Sierra Club is joining. Thank you, Jacob. And also, we're all going to meet her in a little bit, but Heather Bolstrod from OWIHA is going to do a presentation later, and she is also on the Zoom call. So there's a lot of us on here tonight. This is exciting. Okay, I'm now going to pass it over to Dylan, who is our community co-host for the evening.
What's up, everyone? Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks for showing up. You guys are amazing. Way to represent Stockton, everyone. It was really cool, although it's really strange, and I kind of wish I had Ryan's haircut right now because I desperately need a haircut. Anyway, we're just gonna get started. Today, I'll be presenting along with Philip Merlot, who is the Director of Education at the San Joaquin Historical Museum over at Mickey Grove Park. If you've never been there, it's a great place to take your kids. The Weber home is there, and just like a bunch of tractor history. And anyway, it's an amazing place. Hopefully when all these things kind of blow over, we can get back together and all that kind of stuff and experience our own community. But yeah, he's the Director of Education over there, and he's worked as a local historian for several years in Stockton and San Joaquin County, and has definitely have published works in academic journals in history. And so today we're presenting on kind of the history of Stockton. How did we get here? What are the reasons? And although we start our history presentation in the 1870s, we also want to recognize that the AB 617 lands are the lands of the Yokut people. And so we want to pay homage to their rich history, their rich native history, and also to their descendants. And so with that said, Philip's going to take it away.
Hi, everybody. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. Okay. Can everybody see my presentation loading? Can I get a thumbs up from Crystal Lazard? Can you guys see the presentation? Yes. Awesome. Yes. So Dylan asked me to do something really scary, which is talk about the history of Stockton in 30 minutes. The title of this presentation is Historical Perspectives on Stockton, a look back on what led socioeconomic and environmental disparities in Stockton. And just kind of foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about, you see the construction of I-5 here, along with industrial zones in that area. And then, of course, you also see the AB 617 zone that you folks drew up. So I'm a former high school teacher. I always have my learning objectives. So let's think about what our goals are for today. The first is going to be the development of historical awareness of how racialized capitalism, and when I say racialized capitalism, I'm referring to the assignment of value to individuals and communities based off of the colors of their skin and the economic ramifications of that capitalist process, and how that concentrated communities of color and pollution-heavy industries in Stockton's designated AB 617 zone. Second objective is that we're going to understand that the intentional concentration of air pollution sources in South Stockton has led to increased rates of asthma and air quality health burdens in the AB 617 area, which is predominantly populated by communities of color. And I always, again, as a history teacher, I always like to ground my lessons geographically. So this is the map that you folks drew up yourselves, AB 617 community in Stockton. Today, we're going to talk about one really key socio-political process, and that is that economic segregation, which in American context refers to the segregation of people based off of the color of their skin, led to political disenfranchisement, where those communities lost political power in their civic institutions, which then led to public disengagement, where those communities were effectively left out of a lot of really key regional planning processes. And as a result of that disengagement, you had the industrialization of Stockton's segregated landscapes in South and East Stockton, which of course, which is why we're here, has led to negative health and safety outcomes. Let's first look at the historical roots of segregation in Stockton. And from 1870 to 1930, agriculture was this region's primary industrial mover. So prior to the 1870s, San Joaquin County lacked access to water for agriculture. And so most of the farming back then was wheat, dry farming. But in 1866, the state passed the Swamplands Reclamation Act, which allowed capitalists and industrialists from other areas of the state to access waters of the Delta. And that led to massive reclamation, where, again, these really wealthy industrialists from the Bay Area, from Stockton, from other parts of the country, invested in really serious reclamation projects in the Delta that led to the first large populations of people of color in this area, the Chinese community. And they were employed in the Delta as wheelbarrow men, literally using shovels and wheelbarrows to dredge the Delta and then build levees. And the promise of local agriculture then led to another wave of investment capital from San Francisco, primarily, for agriculture in San Joaquin County for about 40 years, between 1870 and 1910. And the lack of technological innovation at the time, right? Holt Manufacturing Company was still in its infancy at that time. You didn't have tractors, you barely had harvesters. It really forced agricultural interests to recruit labor globally. And so laborers from all over the world and the country were recruited to Stockton and San Joaquin County to work in the Delta. And people of color oftentimes came under false pretenses, thinking that they would be allowed to integrate into the regional middle class, but they were forced into labor by employment segregation. And so first Chinese, then African Americans from Mississippi and Alabama primarily, Japanese communities from Hiroshima, Punjabis of both Sikh and Muslim religious affiliation, Filipinx communities and Mexican communities as well, all really immigrated to this area over a 40 to 50 year period, and were consequently, through economic practices, forced into agricultural labor. So just for some context, these are Chinese farm workers on Roberts Island circa 1880. Again, accessing photos from National Archives, you can see, potato agriculture was a major industrial force during this time period. Immigrant communities in Stockton historically were forced into farm labor by discriminatory employment practices. Those practices lasted into the 1950s. So part one, segregating Stockton. Local racially restrictive housing covenants. So beginning in the late 19th century, racially restrictive housing covenants were written into housing deeds to restrict people of color into living in certain zones of the city. And these covenants were typically written into property deeds by developers looking to inflate the value of homes, or in some cases, protect the value of homes. And real estate brokers, organizations, community organizations and associations, nonprofits, they actually worked with city officials to systematize the geography of these covenants, with the most famous manifestation of this being the exclusion of African-American, Indian, Mexican, and Filipinx communities south of Main Street and west of Wilson Way. And the Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and Italian communities were generally restricted south of Harding Way, but still restricted. So this is actually an example of a racially restrictive housing covenant from Tuxedo Park. I'm just going to direct you to the racial clause here. No persons of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. So breaking this down just for a second here, basically this is a legally enforceable clause on a person's housing deed, stating that that person cannot allow for any person who's not white to live on that property unless they're a domestic servant. And this was very common. This is basically all of Stockton north of downtown. And this system actually evolved and was federalized during the Great Depression. So in 1933, in the wake of the Great Depression, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, hereon referred to as the FHA, to deal with the large homeless population caused by the economic catastrophe. And the FHA incentivized developers to build suburbs. And they used explicitly segregationist language in their planning document, the Underwriter's Manual, to do so. And at roughly the same time, in 1936, the FHA also partnered with the Homeowners and Loan Corporation, another New Deal program, to create a classification system that categorized neighborhoods based on their residential security. And this system was color-coded. Residential security, that's essentially a measurement that banks can use. They still actually have residential security today, basically to determine whether or not they would lend to a homeowner. And houses are expensive, right? They cost a lot of money, and most people can't afford to pay for a house all at once, so they have to get a loan. And banks use this residential security value to determine whether or not they would give someone a loan. And it was geographical, so red zones were considered the lowest level, yellow zones were next, followed by blue, then green. Let's take a look at the map and see what this looks like. So this is the redlining map of Stockton from 1936. There are actually 5 redlining maps that were produced over time. This is the very first one. And so what this is, just looking at these red areas, these are areas of the city that the federal government has said are residentially insecure, meaning that the people who live there are not trustworthy enough to access a loan from a bank. And just looking at where this is, Edison High School is right here where my cursor is. So you have 4 highly dense residential areas surrounding it. This is Boggs Tract, Stockton's historic African-American community. Little Italy was here. This is Airport Way, then called Ophir. Main Street corridor heading out to Garden Acres, which was then called Okieville. And you also have a big red area up by Cherokee and Waterloo Roads. Green areas instead, so this is Tuxedo Park. This is where that racially restrictive housing covenant is, this A2 zone. You also have Victory Park. Blue areas were considered a little bit worse than green areas, and yellow areas were considered a little bit better than red areas. And this is the language that the federal government actually used. Yellow areas characterized by age, obsolescence, and a change of style, expiring restrictions, so they're referring to restrictive housing covenants, or lack of them, okay? Infiltration of a lower grade population, again, looking at how various communities of people culturally and ethnically were ranked in the American capitalist system. And red areas represented those neighborhoods in which the things that are taking place in yellow areas have already happened. So detrimental influences, undesirable population, infiltration of it, low percentage of home ownership. Of course, people of color oftentimes were not allowed to own a home. Very poor maintenance, often vandalism, unstable incomes. Again, you're talking about transient communities, agricultural laborers primarily, right? Mortgage lenders will refuse to make loans in these neighborhoods, okay? So again, you're looking at the creation of a segregated housing geography in Stockton. And this was the key to that map. And really, the statistical evidence shows that the most likely predictor of a neighborhood's grade was the extent of housing covenants. Okay, so like the extent of racially restrictive housing covenants and industrial housing covenants really is what created this geography. And it created a very segregated landscape where you had centers of immigrant and migrant farm labor communities like Little Manila, El Barrio del Chivo, Fair Oaks. And you have largely white suburban tract developments in North Stockton, really starting north of Harding Way. And let's be frank, historically, this system was designed to keep people of color from building wealth. Redline neighborhoods where residents could not access loans and thus not buy houses were without exception neighborhoods that the Underwriter's Manual actually listed as mixed or Negro. And as a result, an African American could never build wealth by owning a home, whereas white Americans living in green line neighborhoods could expect to own their own home by paying off a bank loan. So part 2, how does this segregated landscape become industrialized? So between 1930 and 1940, the Port of Stockton really took off. The Port of Stockton was the city's first major industrial park for logistics purposes. And it was built in 1931 and opened in 1933. And for the next 7 years, pretty much right up to the beginning of World War II, it grew faster than any port in United States history. It actually doubled its tonnage every fiscal quarter for 7 straight years. That's practically unheard of and speaks to the value of the port to this area of the state. The port's success led to the realization of local business interests, that Stockton was perfectly centered geographically for logistics industries or industries that focus on the transportation of products. This is still the case to this day, right? You're talking about Amazon warehouses being listed here, et cetera. So here's the Port of Stockton that we all love, right? It's kind of taken cultural significance in the city of Stockton's ethos, right? You know, the Stockton ports, for example. Now, in anticipation of growth, right? So, you know, the city of Stockton is planning for the port before it's actually constructed. The city actually hired a consulting firm called Bartholomew and Associates from St. Louis to design a growth plan for transportation, industry, and housing in Stockton. And one of the first things that the Bartholomew and Associates firm noted is that the geography of covenant restrictions in Stockton led to the need for specific zoning to prevent industry from adversely affecting housing values in wealthy residential areas of the city, right? So these folks realized that there was a pattern between South Stockton being considered low value and North Stockton being considered high value. And so this is actually from one of their reports. The private deed restrictions map, which was an internal map, does not exist now, revealed the methods adopted by property owners and developers to protect their properties by deed clauses limiting the use of land in a subdivision for a certain period. The location of such privately restricted areas were considered in determining the boundaries of various districts, right? So again, Bartholomew and Associates, the very first people to write a city plan for Stockton, noted that Stockton was basically segregated on these housing restrictions, and that affected their zoning. So now I'm gonna go to the same racially restrictive housing covenant, and I'm gonna look at the sentence prior. No noxious or offensive trade or activity may be carried on upon any lot, nor shall anything be done thereon, which may be or become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood, right? So basically, this housing covenant is also restricting the usage of land for industrial purposes. Anything, you know, the term noxious usually referred to emissions, right? So that's why you don't have emissions in Tuxedo Park, for example, right? Pretty much all of North Stockton, you'll see. And Bartholomew and Associates, so this is actually the very first city planning map ever designed just for zoning in Stockton's history from 1939. This map clearly denotes the area of the city zone for heavy transportation uses. Transportation lines in South Stockton were denoted as industrial. So this is the channel. You can see they're already planning a major thoroughfare through downtown. You can see lots of industrial pathways, if you will, just southeast of what would be what was the Port of Stockton. And this is actually an excerpt from the planning document that the Homeowners and Loan Corporation used to characterize neighborhoods in Stockton. And it says right here, detrimental influences. This is a federal document. Heterogeneous population, AKA diversity, surrounded by industrial and business areas. This was considered detrimental. And you look at the inhabitants, Chinese merchants, and Japanese truck farmers. And approximately 30% of an AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander community. Subversive races, right? So these communities were referred to as subversive. This is what affected housing values. And so by the late 1940s, the City of Stockton, Chamber of Commerce, other local organizations, for example, the San Joaquin County Business Development Council, they were all actively lobbying for the construction of freeways in Stockton, as well as other transportation infrastructure. And state Department of Transportation documents, city planning documents, county planning documents, show that these thoroughfares that were built roughly between 1955 and 1970, they were on sites and they were sited according to industrial zoning maps, intentionally near low-income areas to reduce the costs of eminent domain, right? The state was trying to do this as inexpensively as possible, and that meant building them in low-income areas because those areas were less valuable because of the race of the people that live there. And if you actually go back and look at the environmental impact reports, so these are actually EIR documents from 1960 to 1993 for the Crosstown Freeway. You can actually go and see that the state is literally stating that they're going to have to condemn the property that the freeway is going to go over, and that's going to affect the value or the cost of the freeway. So this is actually an excerpt from exchange between assembly members at the 1963 Assembly Interim Committee on Public Works, discussing how the siting of the Crosstown was focused on concerns over distance, okay? Right, you want to do it the shortest route possible. And then later on in that same hearing, it shows that the collaboration with the city over locating the state highways in Stockton was really according to the city's master plan, which was conducted for siting the Crosstown Freeway. And this is actually the 1960 map for Stockton City Plan. And it was used to inform state and local agencies on where, due to zoning restrictions, eminent domain values would be lowest for freeway constructions. And you can see right through here, right? You're looking at right through South Stockton, Crosstown Freeway. You've got industrial zones here, and then these neighborhoods correspond to the redlining districts, right? So you can see there is a very strict correlation between these low-income neighborhoods where people of color were forced to live via segregation and where the freeways would get built. So this is just a superimposition of freeway construction between 1955 and 1993 on the redlining map. You can see I-5 comes down and goes right into the Monte Diablo area near Lewis Park. This was a Japanese and Mexican community in the 1940s and 50s. Then you cross the Stockton Channel. Boggs Tract, the historic African-American community, was just completely obliterated. The areas that were left to the west were right next to the freeway. Highway 4 was expanded. The El Dorado thoroughfare was expanded. Highway 99 was built. And then over a very long process, the Crosstown Freeway was constructed right through a lot of the commercial residential areas, right through Little Italy, El Barrio del Chivo, the Main Street corridor, all the way out to Garden Acres, Okieville. And the construction of freeways in segregated low-income areas of the city led to the city of Stockton to expand the industrial zoning in those areas. And these segregated neighborhoods were actually listed in city minutes as low economic value. And communities actually went to city council meetings to ask for justification why trucking companies were suddenly popping up in their area. And this was the rationale, if you will, as to why that was. Notably, the Barrio del Chivo community actually went before the city in 1958 to ask this exact question. And so the industrial plans developed for the city of Stockton in 1939, 1956, 73, the 1980s, repeatedly listed trucking and warehousing as the city's primary areas for growth. And that was reiterated by business development planners at UOP in the Everhart School of Business in the 80s and 90s. And so during this time period, transportation firms such as Pinella Trucking, Knife River Concrete, which transports concrete around here, Antonini, Cherokee Freight, dozens of others, as well as large warehousing districts in the Port of Stockton, Arch Road corridor, the Stockton Metropolitan Airport, Crosstown Freeway corridors. They were all located in these industrial zones in South and East Stockton by the city and the county. And this left us with this map of zoning today. This is taken from the City of Stockton's online map database. The light blue areas are industrial zoning. So you can look at this. right? So this is the Port of Stockton, Rough and Ready Island, the port. You've got this industrial zoning. And if you drive through this area south of I-5 near Lewis Park, there are people living here. You've got the areas south and west of I-5. You've got the areas north of Highway 4. You've got belts of industrial zoning, roughly where a lot of Stockton's migrant communities had their commercial districts, Little Manila, Chinatown, Barrio del Chivo. You've got the Moore. This is over by the fairgrounds. All of this big area south of Charter Way and down on El Dorado became highly industrialized. And you don't see a whole lot. The yellow is going to be the single-use residential planning, and the brown areas are actually going to be high density. You don't see a lot of single-use, low-density residential planning in South Stockton. And this is North Stockton, right? North Stockton has less than 500 acres of industrial zoning, whereas South Stockton has thousands of acres of industrial zoning, right? Huge disparity. The only industrial zoning you have, Stockton Steel up on Hammer Lane, a little bit over in what you could disputably refer to as North Stockton along the Wilson Way Express corridor, a little bit along I-5 in a few little spots near Swain and West Lane here. But really, North Stockton is a residential park, right? You know, especially north of the Calaveras River, you have big green spaces like Swenson Park, like the county Oak Grove Regional Park. You've got golf courses everywhere, right? You've got big park spaces, lakes, Delta College. UOP is here. You know, I think it's, I guess right here. So you've got, you know, very, very green residential areas. And then this entire area is basically one large residential zone. Okay. So again, looking at the contrast between North and South Stockton, you can see the long-term impact of Stockton's zoning policies. And you can actually see this on Google Maps, right? If you just zoom out, you can see where the industry is: Port of Stockton, El Dorado corridor, around 99, the Crosstown Freeway corridors, right? This is not really disputable in terms of the industrial history of the city. So part 3, health outcomes in a logistics economy, right? So now you've got this really strong logistics economy concentrated in South Stockton. What does that do to the people in South Stockton? And you can actually look at data from the California Department of Public Health on their website, NOAA, and a federal agency with the Department of the Interior, as well as the state California Air Resources Board, that shows that between 1970 and 2000, air pollution, at least by PM 2.5, and respiratory diseases by incidence both increased over time in San Joaquin County, with concentrations in South Stockton, French Camp, and Lathrop. And logistics industries, along with agriculture, are the largest emitters of CO2, smog, and industrial pollutants in San Joaquin County. And air pollution is broadly linked to higher incidence of asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And by GDP, over 70% of all of San Joaquin County's logistics economy sits in South Stockton, as well as a few areas of French Camp and Lathrop that are nearby, right? So this logistics economy, all of these high polluting industries are really concentrated in areas that historically were segregated for areas or for populations of people of color. And you can actually, if you go onto the California Air Resources Board polluter map, you can actually go ahead and look at this. You can see the Port of Stockton, Knife River, the concrete company over on Charter Way, some areas of some polluters along the El Dorado corridor are actually the largest polluters of greenhouse gas emission in San Joaquin County. And air pollution, further, is considered a vector of high blood pressure by the medical community, right? And low-income communities in Stockton, according to the San Joaquin County General Health Needs Assessment, a lot of other studies that you can find on PubMed, generally show higher incidence of elevated blood pressure in low-income communities in Stockton. Furthermore, the concentration of industrial zoning in South Stockton has dramatically restricted the availability of commercial land. And one thing we know that's been around for a long time is that people in South Stockton have generally lacked access to affordable healthcare, right? They've had to drive into North Stockton for their healthcare needs. And this has led to state hearings. This has led to panels from institutions like the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network up in Sacramento on how you reduce this health disparity. And if I didn't explain this, this is because in some cases, dental and medical facilities have a hard time actually finding available land in South Stockton because it's all been zoned for industrial use. And so I'm just going to leave you with this, right? This is the problem I think that the steering committee is really setting out to solve is how do you deal with this history of both the segregation of housing by people of color in South Stockton at the same time, which was used to drive the segregation of industry and industrial industries in particular, right? Logistics, transportation, manufacturing into this area. How do you deal with the long-term health consequences of that? And this is a summary of the most important sources cited. You know, there are about 500 sources that went into this, but these are the ones that I really lean on here. And thank you. And I'll pass it back over to Dylan.
Great. Thanks so much, Philip. That was amazing. Hopefully we have some great discussion around this. Crystal, I just wanted to check in. Do you have time, like 5 minutes for my little presentation real quick?
We do, Dylan. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So let me share my screen. And here we go. Can you see my screen? Can y'all see my screen?
You do.
Yes.
Oh, okay, perfect. Okay. All right. Right. So thanks, Philip, for the presentation. So we kind of, Little Manila comes in that our community emerges from this history, and we're the descendants of folks that kind of had to live through this history and the destruction of their community. And really, Little Manila is just one example of one community that affected many communities in Stockton. And so just thank you for this time to share a little bit about our part of the story, but also understand that many other folks and many other communities have a very similar story to ours. And so it is this history that we're trying to preserve, right? This generation's history from the Filipino perspective. And our families and our community live in the aftermath of what Philip has talked about. Stockton is a center of Filipino American history, but my co-founder, Dr. Don Mabalon, and myself, we were born and raised in South Stockton, but it wasn't until we left Stockton and went off to college. I went to San Francisco State, she went to UCLA, and when we took a Filipino American history class, did we find out that Stockton was the center of our Filipino American history. And so we resolved to come back and to kind of help teach this history and preserve this history. So this is a newspaper clipping from the front page of the Stockton Record at the height of race riots throughout the Central Valley against Filipinos. This is Wednesday, January 29th, 1930. Filipino Club bomb. This is right here on San Joaquin Street in South Stockton in the AB 617 area. Here's a copy of the official redevelopment plan for West End Urban Renewal Project, which was the plan for the building of the Crosstown Freeway. And specifically, there's a quote in here when they're talking about Little Manila. It says, the utilization of these old, deteriorated, obsolete, and poorly designed buildings for transient lodgings has encouraged the seasonal influx of large numbers of marginally useful itinerant workers. And I just wanted to highlight that because it's in this type of language that these documents are describing our communities and our ancestors. And of course, Crosstown Freeway is built, destroying Little Manila. I'm gonna speed on through. And by the time Dawn and I come back from college and reconnect and say, we wanna try to mark and preserve our history, literally one of the last 2 remaining blocks is being destroyed right next to the Crosstown Freeway. And at that time, so this is around 2000, about 20 years ago. And the headline in the newspaper said, "Corner of history falls to progress," right? And when we looked at that, we said, wow, progress isn't even quotation marks. Like this is the definition of progress in Stockton. And what the definition of progress at the time, as opposed to kind of like our history, our culture, diversity, was the building of a McDonald's and a 76 station just south of the Crosstown Freeway. This is what the idea of progress was in 2000. You also have to understand that in 2000, Stockton was the fastest growing city in America. And so we set out to remember and reclaim. We raised funds to mark the area. We designated it a historic site. We worked with the city council to make that happen, and we marked the area. And of course, we unveiled our Little Manila Historic Site signs, which are still up today. This is in 2002. And it was a beautiful event that day. All these folks were there. We closed down Lafayette Street. And it was beautiful in the shadow of the McDonald's and the 76 station. And what we have left are 3 remaining buildings. 4 months after that event, what was crazy was 4 months after that event, which just allowed us to designate the area a historic site, the city of Stockton names this block, which we had just named historic, as a block in a redevelopment area. And there was a plan in the works for over a year to build a strip mall. And so to make a long story short, we then had to fight the city that just helped us name the area historic, and then fight them to not tear down the neighborhood that we had just deemed historic. And we were successful, to make a long story short. And so this was a part of that movement back in the days. There's a great picture of Dawn and her mother. This was us organizing the community throughout the neighborhood. So you're talking about El Dorado to California Street, and then the Crosstown Freeway a few blocks south, right? So we knocked on every single door of home and business that was in the neighborhood, and we organized. So obviously we stopped it. We still have these buildings up. Since then, we've been involved in creating resources, literally writing our own community's history. Dawn wrote the book Little Manila's in the Heart, which was her dissertation at Stanford. She was the first Filipino woman to get a doctorate in history at Stanford. And she was straight up from South Stockton. We're so proud of her. Since then, we've been involved in after-school programs teaching ethnic studies. We have arts programs teaching our youth kind of indigenous and colonial dance, right? Those are some pictures of that. We're teaching music as well. And these are some of our students advocating for educational equity at the state capitol. Been very involved. And here, this brings us to empty tree wells in the Little Manila neighborhood. And so empty tree wells, we found ourselves, folks with Little Manila, participating in an event that was held by Fathers and Families of San Joaquin and the Greenlining Institute, called Greenlining the Hood. And when I was there, I was like, why are we here? Like, we're not in an environmental organization. We're like a history, historic preservation organization. But we went, right? And we found out that the Little Manila Historic Site was in the 99th percentile, according to Cal EnviroScreen, for asthma-related issues in California. And so we kind of how could we stand in the shadow of that history and not do anything about it? And so, so we found ourselves figuring out, well, look, there's a bunch of empty tree wells in this neighborhood. Matter of fact, we counted over 130 empty tree wells in the existing neighborhood. At one point, there was trees there. And so this area was now kind of a hotbed, heat zone, no shade. And we found out that there were urban greening funds through cap and trade funds that were being given out by the state. And so we came up with a plan to plant trees in the neighborhood. And all of a sudden we found ourselves trying to plant trees. And And then what we found was resistance from the city. And sorry, I don't know if you hear my daughter, but she's pounding on my door. She's 2 years old. Anyway, what we found was that sadly, even though we had support from the mayor and we had support from the city council, the city manager refused to partner with us. And of course, they controlled the right of way because these plots were on the sidewalk, and we needed the city's permission. They refused to partner with us, and so yeah, it was really upsetting, and so it kind of stopped us from engaging in environmental justice, and we just said, let's just focus on the things that we know well. But then what happened was then Dawn would pass away, my good friend who I'd met at Marshall Middle School and known for so long. And what she died of was an asthma attack. And what we know of asthma is that if you come from historically redline communities, if you're born and raised there, a child is twice as likely to have asthma than in non-redline communities. And you know, when you go over those statistics, you know, it's you know, their numbers and all that kind of stuff. But then when it happens to one of your friends, you know, it's a whole nother story. And then all of a sudden, this idea of environmental justice kind of takes a whole different view. And here was Dawn's hearse going by the 3 remaining buildings during her funeral. And so what we did next was we wrote a grant through the AB 617 monies, and we named a project called the Dr. Don Mabalan Asthma Initiative. Unfortunately, we were awarded, and it's an education initiative to help educate South Stockton to the environmental threats that we're facing, specifically regarding air quality. And so to end it all, just with Don's passing, we really understand exactly what the threat is to all of us. And on top of that, the AB 617 area is an area we are raising our families in. It is where we go to school, it's where we worship, and it's what we call home. And so we want to thank everyone for being a part of this. This is really an opportunity to heal gaping wounds in our community. And you know, together we can totally make this happen. And thanks so much. And I'm gonna
thank you so much, both to Philip and Dylan, for that very, just very real and very historically enlightening presentation. In the interest of time, instead of moving into breakout groups, what I'm actually going to ask us all to do, I know that was very compelling. So what I'm going to ask us all to do is, when you reflect on this meeting tonight and this presentation in particular, I want you to, or I'm asking of you to think about what resonated with you personally. How have you observed or experienced socioeconomic or environmental disparities in Stockton or in the communities where you reside in? And how does that feel, and what can we do? So I know we have, I think we have like 91 people on this Zoom meeting right now, which is excellent. But in the interest of time, we're not going to open it up for a big discussion at this point. We're going to pick this up. This is a really critical theme, and the storytelling perspective and historical perspective that Philip and Dylan just shared is very important as we transition. So the next piece of this agenda is a really great pivot. Dr. Heather Bolstrad from the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment is going to present a presentation about health effects of air pollution. So in a second, I'm going to turn it to Heather, and she's going to share her screen. But again, think about that historical context and then this scientific reality that Heather's going to share as being sort of this driving force of why we're doing 617 and kind of what we're going to do. So turning it over to Heather. Thank you so much. Heather, I don't see your screen just yet. Dylan, did you stop sharing? And Heather, you need to share screen down at the bottom. There's like a rectangle with an arrow.
There it goes.
There we go. Perfect. Thanks so much. Heather, if you're talking, we don't hear you. Are you on mute?
No, Heather is not on mute. Heather, we cannot hear you. I assume you've been talking. Sometimes microphone may not. Oh, Douglas mentioned double check the volume on your computer. Make sure the volume is up. We still cannot hear you. So Gina suggesting Heather may need to leave the meeting and rejoin. She had to do that earlier because we couldn't hear her. Another alternative is try to call in and switch from audio, from computer audio to your phone audio. And to do that, Heather, you're gonna hover your mouse to the left bottom of your screen where you can see mute and click on little arrow and little menu will pop up and you can switch to phone audio and just follow the instructions. So there's two options how we can, I hope, fix it.
Okay. In the sake of time, let's go ahead and go to John from the Valley Air District, and then we'll circle back to Heather when she's able to. John, can we ask you to share your screen? John's gonna do a presentation on air monitoring capabilities. He's gonna do a very brief introduction because this is something that we're gonna discuss over the coming months as we develop the SERP and the monitoring plan. So John's just gonna do a really quick introduction of the capabilities in anticipation of what we're going to do in June and July and so forth.
All right, great. Thanks, Crystal. Can you guys hear me? Thumbs up. All right, let me share my screen.
Go ahead and share.
All right, can you guys see this presentation? All right, seeing some thumbs up. Okay. Thanks, Crystal. So let me just give a brief overview of this. I know we've got some other topics to go through, but we really just want to get your thoughts flowing on air monitoring for Stockton. And just to introduce myself, again, I'm John Klassen. I'm the Director of Air Quality Science and Planning at the Air District. Had the pleasure to meet some of you a couple of months ago when we had our in-person meeting, and it's great to see so many of you on here tonight. Really excited for this. So as I said, this will be a high-level summary of community air monitoring. This is another one of the key components of the AB 617 program. One of the two being developing our community emissions reduction programs, but the other part is air monitoring in the community. And so there are requirements under AB 617 for us to deploy air monitoring in selected communities, which is what we will be planning to do here in Stockton. And this needs to be in place 1 year after CARB has selected the community. So this will be in place with the goal of January 2021. And this will supplement existing monitoring that's already in place in the Stockton area. We are already working to develop platforms and equipment to use here in Stockton, and I'll say a bit more about that in a little bit. There'll be access to the data for the community here on our own webpage. We'll show the data we're collecting for the Stockton community. There's also a online statewide data portal called AQView on CARB's website where the data will be there as well for you to take a look at. And this is the work we're gonna do here will be similar to the work that we are already doing in South Central Fresno and in Shafter, the first two communities selected here in the Valley. So if you've been following some of the work we've been doing there, this will be somewhat along those lines. I won't go into too much detail here, but essentially the work that we'll do together will lead to us developing a community air monitoring plan, which at the district here, the staff, we will draft up that plan based on your feedback, based on your recommendations for what we should be monitoring and where. We will draft that plan, and then we'll bring that to the committee to review and get your comment on it before we finalize that and move forward with it. And that plan will describe a number of elements here. I won't go into detail, but in general, these elements of the plan will describe the different types of equipment that we'll be operating, where we will be monitoring, what the goals are with the data, what are the actions we will take based on the data that we collect, how are we going to make sure the data is accurate, the equipment is well maintained, and then how are we going to analyze that data and communicate results to the community. So the plan that we'll develop together will go into detail in each of these areas. And just in general, the plan should be clear on its goals and objectives. And this will help us look at, long-term trends of air quality in the Stockton area as well as short-term trends, and that can help lead to what we do with the emissions reduction program. As we develop that together, we can look at what has changed in Stockton over time, and as we collect more community level data, we will better understand what's happening at the local level in the area. Just a bit of detail here on different types of pollutants and the sources that those pollutants can come from. I have them listed here, you can review them, but the types of things that we can measure in the area are PM 2.5 and black carbon, oxides of nitrogen and toxics, carbon monoxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, and different volatile organic compounds. And these pollutants come from a variety of sources, from mobile and industrial, residential sources. They can be formed secondarily through chemical reactions, like ozone, for instance, is a combination of NOx and VOC in the presence of sunlight. So a lot of different things, and we'll get your feedback on this as we get your thoughts on different sources of concern, and that can lead to where we can do monitoring and what kind of things we can monitor for. It's probably hard to see this, but this just kind of gives you a scope of air monitoring in the San Joaquin Valley as it is right now. So we operate monitoring sites all the way up in the Stockton area, San Joaquin County, all the way down to Kern County. We actually have a site down in Lebec, which is almost in Los Angeles County. So a lot of work is done here, and this is a combination of work between district staff and CARB staff, National Park Service, and tribal nations maintain all these air monitoring sites throughout the valley. Specifically in the Stockton area, there is a site currently within the boundary that we're working with here, and that's called the Stockton Hazelton site. This is managed by CARB, and it's been here since 1976. Go to the next slide. It has measured ozone, oxides of nitrogen, carbon monoxide, PM 2.5 and PM 10, toxics, and meteorology. It's at the San Joaquin County Public Health Building near Wilson and Hazelton Avenues. It's been there a long time, so it's great that we already have a long record of air quality data in this community through that site there, so we can review that and see what's happened over the past few decades. And the data that's been collected here at this site will help give us an idea of what's happened so far. That can help complement the community level monitoring we'll be doing in Stockton here as well. Data for this site, Stockton Hazelton, I have the link there. You can check out that link and take a look at historical data that's been collected at this site if you'd like to. We want to make sure that the air monitoring information that we put together and the equipment itself that we put together is going to be scalable and portable and rapidly deployable. We want to be flexible with the equipment that we have to be able to move it around as we need to be able to monitor for different pollutants fairly easily. So we developed these platforms and this equipment to be good solutions for these questions that come up if we want to take measurements in various areas. But we still want to make sure that our instrumentation is high precision and it'll give us quality data. That's really important. We want to make sure the data is accurate. And I have a link here to ARB's CARB's AQView website, so you can check that out when you get the chance. And that's where data that we'll measure here in Stockton will be placed if you want to grab the community level data that we will be gathering. You can take a look at that and grab some of the data that we'll be collecting. We'll also display it on our district website as well if you want to view it that way. So that'll be something we'll be developing as we put this together. Just to give you an idea of some of the resources that we'll have available, there's really four main types of resources that we've been using for South Central Fresno and Stockton that we're working on deploying and using. One of those being an air monitoring trailer on the top left-hand side. That's the biggest platform that we have. We can put a lot of different equipment in there. This could be placed in the most impacted areas since we can measure so many different things, different pollutants. On the top right is a more compact multi-pollutant system. This can still measure a number of different pollutants, but it's all kind of in a smaller area about the size of a refrigerator. So it's more easily can be moved around to different areas of the community And this is a nice resource that we'll have available for Stockton as well. On the bottom left-hand side are more standalone monitors for PM 2.5. This can be placed in various areas throughout the community where PM 2.5 might be a concern. Then on the bottom right-hand side is a picture of a mobile air monitoring van, and we have some of these already developed that we're using in South Central Fresno and Shafter, where we can drive to different areas that we don't have air monitoring equipment placed and actually take some measurements from the van itself to get an idea of what might be happening in some of these other areas. So that'll be something that we can use in Stockton as well. Just a few thoughts on placing air monitoring equipment in different parts of the community. And we'll get into this in more detail as we have an exercise in June or July to get your more direct feedback on this. But we can't place our monitoring equipment just anywhere we want. So we need to get permission from a landowner to place equipment on their property. It'll take some time to establish a lease agreement to make sure that it's a secure location for our equipment to be operating, that there's access to power. We need to think about all of these things, as well as just the proper siting to make sure there aren't any obstructions of wind flow, and just being mindful of the influence of local sources of pollution. If we're wanting to have a monitor measure more ambient conditions in the Stockton community, we don't want to put it right next to a source of pollution that's going to more reflect exactly what's happening at that source. So we need to think about that as we put our equipment into place. Also, just a note about schools too, from our experiences in South Central Fresno and Shafter, there have been recommendations to put monitoring equipment at schools, which is great. That's where kids are sensitive receptors, but it can often be a long administrative process working with school boards to get approval to do that. So as we go through our exercises to get your feedback on where monitoring could be placed, we should also think about other properties near a school that might be a little bit easier and a quicker process to get equipment into place. So just wanted to put that in your minds as well. So all these factors we need to think about as we design our community air monitoring network for Stockton and as we go forward with that. So just a few thoughts for you to think about, just some takeaways that we want you to take some time to think about. Is thinking about where should air monitoring be placed in the Stockton community. You may already have some thoughts based on sources that you are concerned with, where you think there could be some peak concentrations in the area that you want to see some air monitoring data collected for. And then what pollutants and types of sources should we focus on? Is it PM 2.5 that's your main concern? Is it volatile organic compounds, different toxics? We want to hear from you. What is the big concern that you have? And Jess will go through some more details with you on how we can hear from you what you're concerned with in the community. And then all this feedback that we're going to get will feed into our community air monitoring plan that we'll develop together. But we want to hear from you too on what information do you need from us to provide to you to help you give us some specific feedback on what you're concerned with in the community and where we could do some monitoring in the area. So think about these things as we go forward. So the next steps, as we mentioned, we will be doing a more thorough exercise with the committee about community air monitoring, of what you want to see monitored, where you think it should happen, and that feedback will really give us a lot of good information to develop and draft up the community air monitoring plan. Once we have that drafted, we'll share that with the committee, get your feedback on that before we finalize that, and then move forward with getting our community air monitoring network set up for the Stockton community. And there's our general contact information, and that's it for my presentation. And I think we could maybe take a few minutes for a few comments or questions.
Thanks, John. Okay, so just as a reminder of how we're going to do these things, if you go to your participants, which is the little people at the bottom of your little toolbar, you can select the blue hand raising function, and that will tell us that we have a question from you. You'll be in a queue. Hannah is going to manage this. But if you just have other comments or just general questions or requests of John in regards to this presentation, feel free to submit those in the chat box. And also just as a, I know John mentioned this, but as an FYI, we are definitely going to dive a lot deeper into this monitoring as we go over the next couple months. So, and this is just the intro. So if we don't have time to go through everything tonight, don't worry. This is definitely going to be a theme that will come up again. So I'm going to turn it over to Hannah, who's going to manage the Q&A.
So I have the question from Barbara. Oh, Barbara, you disappeared. You just had your hand. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi,
Hi, thanks for that good presentation on monitoring. It was a good overview. So one of the things that you said, John, is you don't want monitors being too close to a single source of pollution. However, we definitely have areas within the AB 617 area where in a geographical area, you have multiple sources of high emissions. So how do you set up for monitoring in those areas properly? Because you don't want a false picture from perhaps one cause of emissions, yet you have to really kind of look at that concentrated whole, I think, if you're going to be able to have any accountability or make any improvements.
Yeah, that's a good question, and thanks, Barbara, for that. Just some thoughts on that. Like I mentioned in the presentation, if we're looking for just more ambient measurements in the area, we probably shouldn't place a monitor right next to a source of pollution. But if we do want to measure any emissions or air quality situations that could be happening right next to a source of pollution, maybe we do want an analyzer right next to that source. But if there's multiple sources right in the same area that we want to take measurements, that analyzer is probably going to capture emissions from a number of those sources altogether. So it's difficult to separate that. Something that could be used is a resource like our air monitoring van, which could, get a little bit closer to various sources of concern to try to separate what the impact could be from each of those various sources into the total whole that's being measured in the area.
Thank you.
We have another question from Douglas. Douglas, I unmuted you.
Okay. John, I have a question. I noted that there are two equipment. That one was overpriced, and the other one was smaller price. And can we get for investment for your buck? Can we have a 2-unit and put it in different office position of concentrated air quality, anything that is pollution or whatever it may be? The thing that my concern is that why would you put something that is invested and put it somewhere that has to be leased instead of be somewhere around a public place where you could put it, have it approved by the city for that particular reason? Why would you add charges for the city to lease something out of those equipment that is pretty much probably a lot to invest? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I think you're asking, like I made a comment that as we think about where we want to place this equipment, we may have to set up leases and pay a monthly cost for that. But yeah, you're right. If we find some locations that are of interest to the committee that are city property or county property, oftentimes those costs can be really minimized or can be nothing in some cases if city or county is okay with that. And I would say as long as there's a location that makes sense to place it and it's secure, there's a source of power, that's certainly something we could take a look at to see if that sort of location would work. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay,
There's questions in the chat.
Oh, there are questions in the chat. Let's take a couple of those, but I do want to circle back to Heather if we can do her presentation as well, so we don't run out of time before we get to that. So I'm looking at see Brad Dawson's question. Do we have a PRT MS that can be outfitted to a van or stationary trailer?
Sorry, Brad's on our team. He was answering a previous question. I think what we can do, this is Jessica Olson from the district. Maybe I've been answering some of the questions. Maybe for the sake of time, I can keep answering those questions in the chat so everyone can still see them. Does that work?
That's great. Okay, let's see if we can circle back. Heather, did you figure out?
I think so. Can you hear me now?
Yay.
We can hear you.
Yay,
Great.
sorry.
No, this is a wonderful learning experience. Again, all of us are figuring out how to do this. And so John will stop his screen sharing, and Heather, if you can share your screen and then walk us through your presentation, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Awesome, it's working.
Yay.
Yay, technology. Thanks, Heather.
Let me, this. Okay. Does that look good? First slide, full screen. Okay, thank you, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So I'm Heather Bolstad. I'm a toxicologist with the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, which, like CARB, is part of the California Environmental Protection Agency. Today, I wanted to talk about some background in the field of human health risk assessment. So what risk is exactly, as well as toxicity and exposure, how OEHA, the department I'm in, determines toxicity, as well as factors that influence toxicity that we have to take into account, and then also health concerns associated with some air contaminants. And finally, how do we determine risk from air monitoring data? So first, let's see if I can use my cursor. Risk. Risk depends on two things, toxicity and exposure. And toxicity represents how dangerous a chemical is. What types of toxicity does it cause, and at what kind of levels? And we use health guidance values to describe the toxicity. Exposure, on the other hand, is whether a chemical or compound contacts the body or enters the body. And in this situation, air monitoring data provides the exposure information. But, you know, other methods such as modeling or predictions can also be used in this process of risk assessment. And then what is exposure? So it's important to note that there are multiple routes. There's oral, dermal, but we're focused, at least in AB 617, on the inhalation route. So these pictures are just examples of possible sources of exposure. Diesel exhaust from diesel-powered mobile sources or equipment, the port, as has been discussed, which has storage facilities, which will require transfer, industry, also pesticides, which the agricultural factors were mentioned in the previous presentation. And then the, freeways, dairies are also a huge source of particularly methane, but other compounds as well, and industry, and then finally rail. So these are just possible sources of exposure to air pollutants. So how do we determine the toxicity of chemicals? So OEHA develops benchmarks for toxicity, which I mentioned, and we call them health guidance values. And we develop two main kinds. One is for non-cancer effects, and a non-cancer effect would be like asthma, respiratory irritation, that sort of thing. So for non-cancer, we develop what's called reference exposure levels, or RELs. And this is the amount of chemical in the air that is not likely to cause non-cancer health effects like asthma, even in sensitive populations like children and pregnant women. So all of our analyses are designed to protect the most sensitive members of the population. In terms of cancer, the health guidance values are typically called unit risks or cancer potency factors, and they describe how cancer risk increases with exposure. So reflecting the relative potency of different chemicals. So a very potent carcinogen would increase cancer risk substantially at low exposure levels, whereas a less potent one would result in substantially lower cancer risk at that same level of exposure. There are a number of things that influence toxicity, but some of the most important ones I wanted to touch on are obviously the amount is important. The length of exposure time is also important, and I'll get into that in a little more detail. And then also sensitivity. So we have all sorts of life stages in the population, from pregnant women, the fetus, infants, children, teenagers going through puberty, the elderly, those with all sorts of underlying conditions, and different propensities to be exposed to different compounds, you know, based on lifestyle and occupation and that sort of thing. So sensitivity is an important factor. And again, we design our health guidance values to be protective of the most sensitive members of the population. So one other important property is the fact that health effects can become more serious as the amount of exposure increases. So you have to keep this in mind, that the effect at a low dose is not necessarily going to be the same at a high dose and just higher in magnitude. The nature can change dramatically. So alcohol is a great example of this, where at very low doses there's no effect, and then, you know, you may feel relaxed, but then eventually at higher and higher doses someone would lose consciousness, and then, you know, have trouble breathing, and then ultimately death can result. So this is an example of how with different doses the effect is different. It's not just a strengthening of one effect. And then in terms of exposure period or duration, we develop reference exposure levels for specific amounts of time, because time period is important. So for brief, or what we call acute exposures, we develop acute RELs that are designed to be protective during occasional 1-hour exposures. And then for moderate exposure, we have what we call 8-hour RELs, and these are for repeated 8-hour exposures over a significant fraction of a lifetime. And these are not occupational values. These are values that will be used when looking at, you know, children at a school and the time they spend at a school, whether that's near a facility or that sort of thing. And then also a worker may be near a pollution source, and so while they're at work, this value would be used in determining their risk. Whereas occupational values are meant for people involved in their actual occupation and those kinds of exposures. And then finally, we have our chronic RELs, which are for constant exposure. So continuous exposures from 1 year to a lifetime. And I have an example here, which is exposure to diesel exhaust, to try to explain this. So if you mow the lawn for an hour using a diesel-powered lawnmower, you could consider that acute exposure. It's short in duration. However, if you live near a freeway, that exposure is chronic. It's every day, potentially for multiple years. So that's kind of an example to illustrate the difference in exposure scenarios. So I wanted to talk a little bit about specific compounds that present health concerns. Particulate matter, I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's not one compound, it's made up of many different ones, but what's important in particulate matter, in particular is the size. So this is a figure showing a human hair, which is about 50 to 70 microns in diameter. And then this is beach sand, which is just a little bigger. These blue spheres represent PM10. So that's particulate matter that's less than 10 microns in diameter. And these are things like dust, pollen, mold, And within the blue sphere, you have PM 2.5 particles. So these are particulate matter particles with diameter less than 2.5 microns. And that includes products of combustion, organic compounds, metals, all sorts of things. And why is this size important? Well, PM 2.5, because of its size, can reach deep into the lung. And this figure I like because it really shows that for larger particles, shown in blue, so above 10 microns in diameter, they kind of just lodge in the nasal cavity due to impaction, whereas larger particles, shown here in yellow, can make it farther down, into the trachea, bronchi. Whereas PM 2.5, so 2.5 microns and less, can make it all the way down into the deep lungs, so the air exchange regions. And the really fine particles like PM 0.1 are thought to enter the bloodstream. So PM 2.5 is a concern in particular because of its health effects, which are the result of it getting down deep into the lung. So short-term exposure has been associated with respiratory irritation, decreased lung function, asthma attacks, irregular heartbeat, and respiratory symptoms. Both short and long-term exposure have been associated with premature death, cardiovascular mortality and hospitalizations, as well as respiratory and asthma hospitalizations. And the sensitive populations include the elderly, those with emphysema, asthma, and other chronic heart or lung conditions. Infants and children, exposure can increase the risk of illness, as well as decreased lung function. And then also in pregnant women, exposure has been associated with decreased birth weight of the infant, as well as preterm birth. So diesel exhaust is an important example, and diesel exhaust includes a good fraction of particles that are PM 2.5. They're less than 2.5 microns in diameter. So many of the health effects diesel exhaust are similar to PM 2.5, including respiratory irritation. Other non-cancer effects include cough, allergies, lung inflammation. And it's not that people are allergic to diesel exhaust necessarily, but it can worsen existing allergies. It also results in increased hospitalizations, ER visits, asthma attacks, and premature death. Sensitive populations, similar to PM 2.5, those with respiratory and cardiovascular conditions, children, elderly. And the main concern with diesel exhaust is it's a potent carcinogen, even though it's a mixture of many different compounds. Collectively, it's a potent carcinogen. So it increases cancer risk, and CARB has estimated that for the average Californian, about 70% of their cancer risk is due to diesel exhaust. So another concern is wood smoke, which is especially an issue in the winter. So you have greater wood burning as well as an inversion layer. And so again, this is a complex mixture, thousands of chemicals, but the most concerning are the particles, carbon monoxide, irritants like formaldehyde, which I'm sure you've heard of. And these irritants may play a role in smoke-triggered asthma attacks. There's also carcinogens, including benzene. And it contributes to indoor air pollution, particularly for polyaromatic hydrocarbons or PAHs. So meaning that the wood smoke in the air outside infiltrates inside, and in some cases may be concentrated inside compared with the outside. So both indoor and outdoor sources of wood smoke are important. And the Air District's Rule 4901 which reduces residential wood burning when certain PM levels are reached in the winter. This rule was associated with decreased hospitalization for cardiovascular disease. So they saw in this epidemiology study that the rates of hospitalization for cardiovascular disease went down when this rule was enforced. Metals are another class of compounds that present some concern, both cancer and non-cancer effects. And on the left are the cancer effects, some examples. Lung cancer, not surprisingly, since that's what we call the portal of entry for air contaminants. And then on the right, various organ systems can be affected depending on the metal, from the nervous system to the immune system, to even hair, skin, and nails. And then volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. You might have heard of these. So volatile meaning at ambient temperature and pressure, they exist as a gas, and organic meaning they contain carbon. And these have been associated with both cancer and non-cancer effects. So some examples of compounds and the tumor types they cause are on the left. And on the right, we have various systems that can be impacted by these compounds, such as benzene affects the blood, that sort of thing. So then finally, what do we do with all of this information? So the approach is different depending on whether it's a non-cancer or cancer effect. So for non-cancer, we compare the concentration in the air to the reference exposure level. So if this is our bright line, our reference exposure level, and the concentration measured in air is higher, there may be some concern. But there's a caveat, because when we develop the reference exposure levels, we incorporate several factors that we call uncertainty factors. And these help to address any sources of uncertainty in the assessment, but also human variability and sensitivity. So we kind of include a buffer in developing the reference exposure level. So if exposure is higher than the reference exposure level, it does not mean that a health effect will result. There's just a higher risk of it developing. And then if it's lower, there's less concern. So for cancer, it's a little different. We look at how much does the exposure from that amount in the air increase cancer risk by. And for this, the kind of threshold is the risk target. And for the general population, the goal is insignificant increased cancer risk from chemical exposure. So if the risk is calculated and it's found to be above this threshold, there will be some concern, and depending on how far above will influence the level of concern, and then potentially action to decrease the risk. And then if it's lower, there's less concern, but I want to note that we do consider cumulative exposure. So you may be exposed to 10 compounds, and each one in the air poses a risk level that's below the target, but cumulatively, so being exposed to all of them at the same time, may result in a cumulative cancer risk that is of concern and above this line. So that's all I have. I'm happy to answer questions either now or if there's time.
There are a few minutes, and I know we won't have Heather always. So I do want to ask that if you have longer questions, she's, I'm sure, very great and gracious, and we'll take the time to follow up. Here's her email. But if you have any quick questions right now, perhaps like a question asking for clarification about something that Heather shared, go ahead and raise your hand in the participants box, your little blue hand. And if you're participating only on the phone and not the Zoom meeting, just a reminder that you can dial *9, and that will raise your hand as well. And so Hannah is going to turn around and manage this.
Yes, yes. So we have one question from Jean, and Ed goes second. Jean Fuss, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I could just read some of these questions alternately.
That works too.
I'm trying to, okay.
Heather, are you reading the chat box?
Yeah, is that okay?
Some of them were already answered. So I wonder if we want to, while you're reading, I wonder if we want to go to Ed and then Barbara.
Sure, sure.
Heather, thank you for the presentation. It was outstanding, particularly the PM 2.5 portion of it. But I do have some concerns. The truck that you had showing blowing black smoke up into the air is a non-existent animal in California for the most part. That truck had to be pre-2008 because all the newer engines can't leave that much particulate in the air, that much black carbon, or that truck was illegally running bunker fuel, which is a fuel that's been banned in California. There's been a tremendous amount of effort from the industry's part to reduce PM 2.5 through lots of different mechanical filtration on the trucks that are on the road today. And my only comment is I don't think that's a fair, while I recognize that diesel particulate is an issue, I don't think that picture represents the trucking industry as we know today in California.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. So there are some diesel-powered vehicles or equipment that wouldn't meet the current emission standards. This includes agricultural equipment, that sort of thing. But yes, that is an extreme example, the black smoke.
Thank you.
So do we have time for another question?
Let's do one more and then we're going to move to Jessica.
Okay, Barbara, go ahead. You are unmuted.
There we go, thanks. The photo was actually, I think, a little bit helpful because we do see a range in truck emissions, I think, in the area in terms of what's actually coming out from emissions. My question, though, is really directed towards peat soils. There is history of peat soil causing lung disease. So I was trying to get a handle on with peat soils that become airborne. What's the micron range?
I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. It's probably going to include both PM 2.5 and PM 10. Okay. But one unique characteristic of peat soil would be the microbes, and so that could increase the inflammatory reaction from exposure. So I can look into it a bit more for you in terms of the size range, but I'm sure there's plenty of PM 10, but there could be some PM 2.5 as well. But again, what we call endotoxin or any bacteria and whatnot, as well as pollen, plant compounds can increase the inflammation that sort of exposure causes. So it's not only, we focus a lot on size of particles, but the components in the particle also play a role.
Okay, that would be great information. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your expertise with us tonight. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us forward, but Heather's email is here, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And you are also welcome to work through myself or Hannah or the Air District staff. We're going to continue to explore and resolve a lot of these concerns, but I do want to leave enough time to turn it over to Jessica. Jessica is going to present a really brief introduction to an online tool that's being developed to gather your inputs and concerns and really identifying where the sources of air pollution are. So this is a very exciting addition to this Zoom format. We're going to go deeper with this new online platform that, again, is new. So we're all learning together. But thanks so much, Jessica, for introducing us to this tool.
Absolutely. I'm so happy. So I'm going to share my screen right here. And I'm just going to let you know what I am sharing right now. We will send, or we just sent out to the community, I believe last night when we sent the reminder about this meeting. We also shared with you a link. That's the valleyair.mysocialpinpoint.com/AB617 Stockton. We will also post this on our website in the same place that we post the agenda. So don't worry. If you do have the ability and the capacity and maybe even the screen space, if you can open this, you can walk through it with me. Otherwise, this is being recorded. So if you have any sort of a need to go back and kind of remember how to access this, we will also post that on the website. This is our landing page for what will eventually maybe grow into more sort of community engagement tools. But really this whole meeting, I think it's so obvious it's set up not only the historical and systemic need for sort of intervention in this community, but also it's very obvious that a lot of community members, especially those that made time to come here on their afternoon or evening tonight, are very concerned about air quality here in Stockton. And so this tool is really the district's sort of first step in understanding those specific air quality concerns. We are in the middle and really close to finishing developing tools that are answering a lot of the great questions that have sort of popped up in the chat about emissions from certain sources and really specific thoughts on different mobile and stationary sources throughout the area. But before we sort of just from our perspective tell you what the science and data says about emissions, we also want to know from you what have been your concerns historically. And that's really what this map is about. So if you go to this website, right when you click to that link, it'll take you to this site. If you scroll down, the only button really to push is this map of air quality concerns. And so I'm just going to quickly go over high level and just kind of let you know what the whole point of this is. This just gives a background on AB 617. And really the idea, again, it says it right here, help us share your story on this map. And the really cool part about this compared to what we've done in person in the past, I think this is actually a new kind of almost better opportunity than what we would have done in an in-person meeting, is that it gives us a little bit more time to get that feedback. We're going to have this open for a couple of weeks. And so I think that'll give us a lot of time to engage with other community members and understand what's happening here. When you first open this up, once you click that Get Started Now button, you'll see that these are all different types of sources, or even just things that might pose an air quality concern to you. There's also other, of course, something that I'm sure we haven't captured. Now, eventually when this is filled with a bunch of markers, this will be really interesting. You can turn on and off different sources, but right now it's blank. So if you click, this is a little filter button. You can click that, it'll hide it and go away, and you can just sort of see this empty map here. Now, if I'm concerned, say, about train traffic in this area, I can click this button that says Add Source of Air Quality Concern, and all those buttons that I showed you earlier would pop up. And I would click the one that pertains to what I'm concerned about. So if it's train or rail activity, I can click on that. I can drag this map around and just plop it wherever I think I might need it. So I can just click this button and drop it. Add my comment up here. So I'm concerned about trains idling here. For me, since I've done this before, it automatically filled in my email address, first and last name, and I'm not a committee member, so I'm going to pick no. But this would be something for the first time you do it, you have to fill in, and then you would just, there's a remember me button that would pop up for you. You would agree to that your comment will be shown and used in our process, and then you would click add comments. Oops. There might be a server issue here. Hold on, let me refresh. I've had it open for like 3 hours now, so could just be a little bit of a hiccup. So once again, I'm adding my source. Maybe I'll, right here, I'm not going to draw a line. Not a member. And add comments. All right, well, let me pivot really quickly to open. It wouldn't be complete if not every single presentation had like a moment of a hiccup, right? All right, here we go. It probably, so I'm an admin on that account, so it's possible that that was the case. So we're gonna open it up here. So I think, can we all see that this, okay, thank you, Crystal. All right, so same thing, I'm opening up my source of concern map. I'm taking away the little toggles. I'm adding a source of concern. Rail activity again, just because I keep now using it as my, and perhaps maybe this is the issue and I can change it if I want. So rail activity, I'll just put rail. Again, I'm gonna add my email address. So this, I'll just use my other address. Click remember me so that I don't have to do this every time I add a comment. So I'm gonna put my first name, my last name. Again, I am not a committee member. I have an option to attach a photo. Maybe I have driven by this place so many times, or I want to go and show you, maybe it's something that's smoking or regularly operates in a manner I think is unsafe for air quality. I click add my comments. It's possible they're having an internal server error on Social Pinpoint. I'm going to try one more time with a different source of concern, but otherwise what I'll do is you guys can continue to click in here. Maybe it will work for others. I'm going to try passenger vehicles and just kind of place it here. Oh, maybe it didn't like my rail comment. It was really being offended by that somehow. So anyhow, you can see here that when you zoom out, and again, this is the project boundary, you can see here, not only do you see my pin, but you can actually click on it and see what I said. Now, I didn't say much of substance here, it just said cars, but maybe someone understood what I was going for, and someone else can then go in and comment, I agree, cars. They would then have to put their email address once more, and they could provide a comment on your comment or something that you dropped. You can drop your own pin right next to it. Even if you do agree, you can similarly just drop a different pin. You can like someone's comment and provide some feedback in that regard. And ultimately, once you start adding different types of sources of concern, say port activity, as you can imagine is probably happening near the ports, you would place your marker there. Ports, again, these are all tests. I will remove my non-comments. I'll have them remember me. And it's closed. So now when I go to take a look at the map, which eventually will be filled, hopefully, with lots of different comments from all sorts of folks, and especially residents in the community, I can toggle it on and filter it. If, say, I just want to look at the passenger vehicle comments, I can just click on passenger vehicles. It'll show me just those vehicles. Same thing with port activity, or I can have them all on and see the map all over. Eventually, you'll probably want these filters. I imagine with the number of people we have on this, we'll definitely get a lot of feedback here. You do have the ability to comment outside the boundary. Of course, as you know, air pollution doesn't necessarily have boundaries in that regard. So if there's something outside you think might be influencing, that's fine. We have the ability when we go later to filter through the comments and really take these in as sort of the way for the district to understand kind of the next steps in the process based on your feedback. We will be able to take a look and see, oh, that was outside the boundary or that was inside the boundary. So that's perfectly fine. And then really another thing that I wanted to point out here is that if you felt like you kind of know where something is, but you really more like know the name of it, but you don't know exactly where it is on a map, you can type it in here. I'm typing in Edison High School, Stockton. Oops, that's taking me to Stokes. That's okay. In other words, you can type in, say you typed in your own address is maybe a better example. I just didn't want to single any one particular person out. You can type in your address and it would definitely direct you to your address. Especially say you had dust issues, or maybe there's often smoking that you're not understanding where it's coming from, or you do understand and maybe a lot of people are illegally burning in your area. Those are the sorts of things that we want feedback on. A lot of that is really just going to help us understand if the majority of the comments we get are based on idling traffic or trains or trucks in certain areas, or maybe they're based on other sources that are kind of scattered throughout that industrial zone we talked a lot about today. That's just going to help us design a lot of the discussions around monitoring, placement, as well as the emissions reductions programs. So I know it's just really high level, and I even ran into some technology issues myself. Are there any sort of just high level questions about this program and sort of how it's going to be used?
Jessica, there were two questions in the chat box. One is about translation. Is this tool available in other languages? And if you can point out where that Google Translate button, because it's hard to find, and speak about other languages capabilities. The second question is, where can we find the link to the tool?
Yes, I will answer both of those. Great questions. The first question, as of right now, we have used the automatic translate button for a couple of reasons. One is right now, based on sort of the way that this system works, the only way to get this whole thing in a separate language is to create a separate map. And while that map will look identical in the initial setup, you would then be unable to see everyone's comments. You would have to go through different maps, and it would just segregate everyone that's speaking different languages into different maps. And so it wouldn't really create a full picture of the community input. So what this program does is it allows us to use Google Translate, albeit I am sure with lots of translation flaws, but at least for now, and we're totally open to feedback, if you find that yourself or someone else in the community is wanting to look at the map, this button right here, and I agree it is a little bit hidden, is the translate button. You can select language from any of these languages. And so once you select your language, so Spanish here for instance, it's going to attempt to translate what's ever happening, and it will try to even translate the comments from others. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but this is actually closer to the committee members being able to read and understand each other's comments than if we had them on separate maps. And we felt like, at least for now, again, this is all up to feedback. If we want to do it differently, please let us know. At least for now, this actually allowed us to have multiple different languages and not just sort of the two that we've so far been translating into. The second question, we sent out the link yesterday. We will also post this on the website, so at community.valleyair.org on the Stockton page. So I'll just show you where that is right now. We have not posted it yet, but we will ASAP. So Stockton Community.
And they're also
right here.
Mm-hmm. And is this tool available for the public or just committee members?
For right now, we have it open to the public, and that's why there is a question about whether or not you're a committee member. We also require that you put your first and last name as well as your email address, so we will still know who is committee and who is not. But this will allow us to get a bigger picture. If you know other residents in the area that would like to comment or provide comments, then that would help us. Again, this is just understanding sources of pollution. This isn't any sort of decision-making process about where to place monitors or what sort of strategies to take.
Okay, great. Just one final, I know there was a second part to that last question. Is there going to be any sort of like advertisements or social media push or an effort to get this made aware of, you know, folks that aren't necessarily on this community steering committee or following us via Facebook Live currently?
I can handle that one. We're not going to broadly advertise it because we really want folks to know about AB 617 and be in the context of this entire process. Because if we were to take it out to wider advertising, who knows what could happen. This map could be taken over by one entity and they're just focused on one thing. So really, ideally, if you have people that you want to be involved and you want their efforts, folks can mute, that would be great. And you want their information to, their input to be a part of this, then definitely share it with them. But as far as doing like mass advertising about it, I'm a little concerned that it might get overrun, and really we want people to be involved kind of in the entire process holistically, rather than just coming in and playing with this map and then not really taking any input and kind of what the entire process is about. That is a great entree though. If you know people that want to be more involved, please send them to our Facebook page. This entire meeting has been streamed live on our Facebook page and will be archived there. We'll archive it on our website as well. So if people want to, watch this meeting and kind of see what happened, they're more than welcome to.
Thanks, Jamie. Okay, we have hit our 7:30 meeting close, but there are a few just wrap up next steps I want to do. So thanks in advance. Typically, we'll always try to end on time.
Crystal, before I forget, in the one agenda down below, it's a reminder that please visit the community value headquarters to elect the community select and complete source concern exercise by May 24th. What does that mean?
Sorry, I can answer that. That is what I just showed you. If we want to have some sort of end date to it so we can take in all the information before our June steering committee meeting. So the sources of concern exercise is using that map to drop your pins and figure out where, or let us know rather, where your sources of air quality concern are. I will say something I didn't mention, sorry, Crystal, is that if you have, say you're having trouble opening the map, or you just want to tell us what your sources of air quality concern are, that is still an option. We thought the map would be a good spatial tool, but we are still taking typical comments where you can email ab617@valleyair.org. You can give any one of us a call and let us know, and we can verbally just have that exchange and keep that as part of our understanding, our record, and then our report back to the committee.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks for noting that, Douglas. That's an important date to note. So speaking of that June meeting, we do anticipate that it will probably be virtual, the way that this one was. Again, conditions do change constantly, so we don't know. We'll keep you abreast. But anticipating that, we wanted to do a really quick poll to see. Oh, it's not letting me poll. Okay, we will send it out after the meeting since we're over time anyway. We're going to send you out a poll after the meeting to gauge you on what your preferred meeting times are. We'll give you a couple options and what meeting times you cannot do. It's likely we might keep this, but I also just want to gauge and see. We have down to 85, but we had 91 people on this call earlier. We want to make sure that we can maintain high attendance to really harness all of your great ideas. So look for that. I do want to say, I think the community co-host role is really critically important. Thank you so much, Dylan and Philip, for doing that tonight. Before we close, I am looking for volunteers. I can just sort of throw that out there. We can have somebody raise their hand now, or we can, you can email us, the Air District or Hannah or myself, if you are interested in being a community co-host. But in anticipation of that, maybe just raise a hand if you're interested now, and we'll capture that.
And when you say raise your hand, you mean blue hand or actual? Maria.
The blue hand. Yeah, thank you, Hannah, for that clarification. The blue hand. So I see Mariah from Restore to the Delta raising her hand. Douglas, Esperanza. Okay, good. We got a good list. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow up with these individuals that have volunteered. There's several meetings, opportunities to do this over, every meeting will probably have a different community co-host. So thank you so much for that. And again, if you didn't raise your hand and you still want to do this at a future meeting, please let us know. So we are at time, and I want to just check in with Anthony to see if there were any comments on the Facebook live stream that are critically important to address at this time? I'm seeing.
And I am
No.
not seeing any
Heather.
that are on Facebook Live.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony. So I know this has been mentioned by a couple speakers, but all the presentations that you saw today, this Zoom meeting recording, the transcript of the chat box, and eventually a meeting highlights will all be posted on the website. But please look for that email that you received last night from Heather Hinks from the Valley Air District that has the links to the online social pinpoint map that Jessica presented tonight. We really want to get as much of that information as possible as we move forward. Our June meeting is scheduled currently for June 3rd, and it will likely be again Zoom-based, but we'll stay tuned. So thank you so much for all of your participation tonight. I'm so grateful that we are here. So thanks everyone, and have a great night.
Great job, Crystal. Thanks everyone. Also, we'll be posting, I'll send you guys Philip Merlot's presentation as well. Thanks everyone, stay safe.
Fantastic, thanks everybody.
Thanks all, have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye,
Good job,
everyone. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good job, y'all.
Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you, Dylan. Have a good night.
Buddy.
Crystal, can you turn off Facebook?